When it comes to technology, the United States and China, as two countries, both of which have very strong indigenous tech sectors, are finding that the opportunities for cooperation are becoming fewer, and the sense that they're in competition with each other is becoming greater. So in that sense, semiconductors, which of course are one of the most important components of pretty much all technologies that involve essentially most elements of modern technology, are becoming more and more of an area where both sides feel that cooperation is very difficult. And since the production of semiconductors is one of the areas at the moment where China so far does not have really high quality indigenous production, that's a problem in that sense.
Is there a sort of inevitability in the tensions between China and the US when it comes to any manufacturing issue?
There's an element of tension that is going to be there for quite some time to come, which was in a sense crystallized, but not caused by the previous US administration of Donald Trump, which made a much more upfront, much more explicit policy of insisting that China increase the amount that it imports from the United States, mostly concentrating on agricultural goods, but at the same time also making it clear that it would be much more hardline than its predecessor administrations in terms of the shipping of sensitive technology. Now that comes, of course, at the same time as the era, maybe the last decade or so, where China has actually been putting a lot more of its own resources into indigenous developments in technology, spending, I think, about 2.4% of GDP on research and development across the private and public sector in China. That's a very large proportion for a middle-income country. And therefore, with those two developments coming together, an indigenization of technology, which of course is a political as well as an economic gesture in China, and a much more hardcore attitude from the United States, which the Biden administration has carried on, this has created a kind of tension which isn't going to be easily resolved just by one or two relatively small gestures.
So you see what President Trump started being carried on by President Biden?
I think the direction of travel in terms of China policy in some ways is similar. The language is very different. And I have to say that that's probably an important part of making sure that the relationship between the two sides remains civil, remains active. Some of the channels of communication that were essentially shut down under the Trump administration are being opened up again. And we see visits by American officials to China and Chinese officials to the United States. And that's an important element to be there. But I think we shouldn't use that as a way of mistaking the profound and really very fundamental shift that's taken place in the last few years in terms of the way in which the two countries view each other. China and the United States essentially both have a strong interest in making sure that technology standards, capacity for innovation, the ability essentially to also make sure that not just their own countries, but countries which adopt their technologies, use their standards. These are all the areas which the next generation of leaders is going to have to deal with. And both the United States and China, I think, have a fairly strong-minded attitude that they want to be on top in that particular competition. That hasn't changed in Washington.
So how is this going to play out in the case of semiconductors?
Well, I think at the moment we see that there is a short-term issue which is partly to do with the pandemic in that supply of semiconductor chips across the world remains quite constrained. Essentially, and there are a few exceptions, but essentially for the really high-quality semiconductors, the top-level ones, you're talking about two places in the world that produce them. One is South Korea and one is Taiwan. Now, the question is whether in the short term, as the world comes back to trying to revive the economy, as the pandemic, we hope, begins to recede, is any major actor really willing fundamentally to break up those supply chains? We don't know the answer to that yet, but it seems to me that since the top priority for so many economies, the United States and China amongst them, is to first of all get the economy humming again, smashing up those supply chains, basically trying to either in some ways take an unprecedented action which would restrict the flow of semiconductors, just seems quite unlikely. So I think despite all the language, we've got something of a status quo in the short term. In the longer term, of course, we'll have to see how the semiconductor industry develops globally.
China has been, I think it's fair to say, a game changer in many areas of technology, nanotechnology, AI, and so on. Where do you see China going specifically in the area of microchips?
Well, I think it's fair to say people who look in detail at the semiconductor industry would say that when it comes to, decent second-tier production, China has made quite a lot of strides in recent years. And certainly there is semiconductor manufacturing in China, which all serves part of the dual circulation economy model, the idea that more and more is going to be produced at home in China itself for the Chinese economy. The problem for China lies in the really kind of innovative top tier of semiconductor production, which is really something that involves American design and Taiwan and South Korean manufacture. And that's something that China so far has not really found itself in a position to reproduce. Now, it may be that the amount of money that's being put by R&D in China into that particular development is something that will change their production capacity in the next few years. But right now, analysts would say that China still lacks the capacity at that elite top tier level to produce the kind of really high quality semiconductors that are still very much a product, really, of the technology of the United States.
If that's the case, how do you see the global market playing out? The EU and US, for example, have both suggested they want a bigger slice of chip manufacturing too.
I think that's right. And I think that the EU in particular is worried about the lack of European game changers, European innovators in this and other spheres. You could argue that the US, China, even some smaller players, South Korea, Israel amongst them, have perhaps been more innovative in various aspects of tech than the EU as a whole, although of course there are individual countries within it, including Germany, that have produced some really important innovation. So I'd say in those areas, we could expect to see an awful lot more investment from European players in some of these key areas. I suspect there'll be cooperation with the United States, but one of the things that the Trump administration experience has, I think, brought home to many European leaders is that it's important to have indigenous capacity within Europe as well. And that's one of the areas that I suspect there'll be a lot more concentration on in the next few years.
Professor Rana Mitter, Oxford University. Many thanks, Professor, for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.